let me share here. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Okay, so thank you very much. So this talk is being presented on behalf of Ben Anderson, who's a colleague from the University of Southampton, and also Vincent Dirks, who did the coding for the modeling work. So what I'd like to do is talk, basically just give you one slide looking at an international example of air pollution, one on the local context in New Zealand, and then talk to you a little bit about the model that we developed to have a look at air pollution levels as a result of COVID in Auckland. Hopefully, okay, so here's my one international example here. So this is, I mean, no doubt many of you will have seen all these articles that came up in the newspaper that we're looking at that showed remarkable improvements in air quality during the lockdown period. And this is just one in France that was showing the levels of NO2 from a satellite called Copernicus Sentinel. And it basically shows what the air pollution levels were like in March, the year before lockdown, and then comparing to what was happening during this year. And so there's quite a few of these types of figures that have been appearing in the newspaper. And it really certainly highlights all the significant reductions that occurred in air pollution levels during this time. So there's been quite a lot of work all around, either looking at satellite images or looking at surface air pollution levels. And often people were saying, you know, air pollution levels have dropped by 50% or 60% or 80%. And often it was comparing to previous years at the same time of year. And of course, this particular environment was great in terms of, you know, presenting a large sort of what if scenario associated with air pollution. In New Zealand and in Auckland, the situation was very similar. We went into lockdown on the 25th of March. And at this time, so this is an example of the city centre in Auckland. So everyone was required to stay at home. We could go out only, certainly by car, only for the purpose of essential services. Schools were closed, travel was restricted. So the traffic on the roads was considerably reduced compared to what it would normally be. At the same time, people were very much encouraged to go out and exercise, as Lee mentioned. So that was something that people were told that was important to do in terms of mental health reasons. It's actually quite hard to know whether people were exercising more or less. So it's great that you've been doing that work, Lee, in terms of surveys, because it certainly looked like on the streets when you went out that there was far more people than there normally are. But of course, they're not going to gyms, they're not doing those other types of sports that they would otherwise do. So there was cycling, there was running, and there was walking, but there wasn't much else that people were able to do. But certainly a lot of people were out, a lot of them trying to obviously ensure that they obeyed the rules of social distancing. And so pretty much because of the low traffic flow rates on the streets, everyone was actually walking down the street because the footpaths definitely were not adequate in terms of allowing for the number of people that wanted to be using them. So rather than being closed, the streets were very much alive. I mean, it was actually quite fun to be going out and walking down, you know, the main road that's normally quite a significant arterial and sort of take over that space. And I actually rode a bicycle for the very first time in a very long time, and that was really fun. And I felt quite safe in doing so. There were a lot of comments that people made in terms of the improved soundscape during the time. So people commented the fact that you could actually hear lots of birds about and the wildlife and things that you wouldn't normally be able to hear nearly as well. And people also commented a lot about the improved air quality. And particularly, I think the people with asthma and other breathing conditions, they said, hey, it's so much easier to breathe. Whether it was genuine or psychological, I don't know, but they certainly commented on that. So like I said, lots of articles in the newspaper saying air pollution's gone down by 50%. This one here said 90%, so different estimates were made. As some of these were done based on satellite and some of them based on surface measurements. So while these are a reasonably good estimate of the reductions that were observed, of course, air pollution is very highly dependent on the surface local meteorology. So it's very hard to tell by just actually looking at the observed concentrations, you know, how much of the drop in pollution levels are caused by a drop in traffic flows and how much of it is caused by the fact that it just happens to be conditions that are conducive to lower air pollution. So for example, it might just have been a windy few weeks and the air pollution was low because of that. So it's really hard to get some reasonable sort of quantitative estimates of these types of things. So this is where the model came in. So we went about applying a model that I developed some time ago that essentially takes information about the wind speed and the wind direction and historical data associated with air pollution and tells you what you can expect the air pollution levels to be, assuming the traffic that it has been historically. And so what we did was to run this for the period. Okay. So essentially, this is the model. It's almost about as simple as you get in terms of an air pollution model. So it's called a box model. So essentially, the wind comes along and pushes air across a box. The cars emit the pollution into the box, and it's then distributed evenly within the box, and then the wind sort of pulls it away. So depending on the traffic flow and how much air pollution is produced in the box, and the mixing and how quickly that moves through because of the wind speed, you can predict what the air pollution level is going to be, and then you optimize that. So the idea is you look at the traffic flow at a certain time of day, compare it with the concentrations, and you run regressions for different times of day, weekends, weekdays, and also split the data into upwind and downwind depending on which side of the road or which direction the wind is blowing in. So essentially the model consists of a series of regression parameters for different times of day and different wind directions. So essentially what we did was we optimized this particular model for 2019 for the correct time of the year. And so we had a model that would tell us what the air pollution levels could have been had the traffic flows actually been normal during the lockdown period. Okay, and so, oops, there we go. So this is just an example of the model being run. Actually, it's for a site in South Auckland, and this was a few years ago now, probably 7 years ago. So it's a completely normal situation, but just shows how reliably the model can actually predict air pollution levels. So the first one shows NOx, the second one is carbon monoxide, and the third one is PM10. And so the gray is the observed concentrations and the red is the predicted. So we've got a fairly reliable way of being able to train up a model to be able to tell us what we would expect the air pollution levels to be under normal conditions. And so this is what we came up with in terms of concentrations for the lockdown period. This is for a suburban site on a fairly main arterial in Auckland. The top one is black carbon and the bottom one is NO2 concentrations. The red line represents the time when we went into lockdown. So essentially the 3 weeks leading up to the middle of the graph are periods where essentially traffic flow was normal. And so we'd expect to get a reasonably good match between the observed and the predicted concentrations. So in this, the color I've used here is the dark blue is the observed concentrations and the light blue is the predicted. So pretty much for both of the pollutants, you're getting a reasonably good match leading up from the beginning of March to about the 25th of March. And then after, so about the 25th of March, we went into level 3. So things started getting a little bit funny the couple of days before we got to March 27th. And then from 27th on, that's considered to be lockdown period there. So this is what we got, and what we can see here is that certainly from the 27th onwards, and I've only taken it up to, I'm obviously a little bit behind here, 17th of April, so I'm going to be extending that once I've got the updated data, so I've got distracted with other things in the meantime. But clearly we can see some significant drops in terms of observed concentrations compared to what we would have predicted. So had the traffic flow been normal, we would have expected the dark blue line to match up with the light blue line, and clearly that's not what we're getting here. So definitely some significant reductions, and from that we can get some statistics which will tell us reasonably reliably how much of a drop in concentration we would have gotten. So interestingly enough, I would expect now that the levels, we haven't got the data yet, but I would expect the levels to be pretty much back up to normal. If you go around Auckland, you know, the traffic flows seem to be what they always were, I guess, before the lockdown, which is a bit unfortunate. There's still some people working from home. So I think at university, rather than having everybody in 5 days a week, I think people are, I don't know, Lee, what you think the proportion is, but I think probably maybe half people are back now, or people are tending to work, you know, 2 or 3 days instead of trying to work 5 days. I don't know whether there's anybody who started cycling during lockdown who is still continuing to cycle to work post-lockdown. I'm not sure about that, but I do fear that we're going to end up going back to normal pretty quickly, and that those air pollution levels are going to head back up again. But let's hope people have thought a little bit about how pleasant the environment was, you know, when there were less cars on the road. And perhaps some people will have converted in terms of their mode of commuting to something a little bit more sustainable as a result of all of this. So thank you. That's it for me. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.